Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our final installment of the 2026 GOSA webinar series. Tonight, we have Tara Cross, who will be doing an introduction to giant hot periods. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Tara.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. My topic is Introduction to Giant Hot Periods, and just going to nerd out a bit about this, even though they aren't happening right now. I know some people were curious if this was going to be immediately relevant, but I did want to just get it out there and get going. So thank you so much to the GOSA board and Ben for facilitating this. And I've got some other thank yous here for photos and figures and for background information on giant hot periods that I learned kind of on the job watching them. I've been a geyser gazer since 1988. I've worked in Yellowstone in various capacities over the years. And I was really excited to find this photo here on the left, which is the very first giant hot period I saw in 1989. No chance for giant at the time. You could see it's just focused there on the platform. I like the CB antenna in the corner. It's a nice touch. And then the photo on the right is at my very first giant start in 2001. That was an exciting moment for me. In this presentation, I will describe the platform vents and the hot period sequence, uh, go into some detail about how we would define weak, medium, and strong hot periods, give some tips for observing and recording hot periods, and when to look for strong hot periods. Not in this presentation would be the topics that I covered in my previous GOSA presentation, which you can find on the YouTube channel under live introduction to giant geyser. And in that presentation, I did a historical overview of giant activity. I talked about underground connections in the giant area, and I talked about possible indicators of changes in the giant system. So if you're interested in any of that, and it's probably a bit more relevant right now because giant is quiet, you can find it there. Also not in this presentation is a detailed history of giant hot periods, statistical analysis, detailed discussion of grotto geyser that is worthy of talking about, but it is a whole other uh, subject area, would require its own presentation. And then finally, I did not include videos in this presentation. I really want to present as much information about hot periods, and then there are many places where you can find good videos of both giant eruptions and just hot periods. The two best are David Schwartz's YouTube channel and Heinrich Koenig's blog page, where he's got a lot of historical hot periods, especially very interesting video collection there as well. Some background information just to talk about where we're at right now with Giant. The last active phase ended in March of 2019. The last two intervals have been just under 5 years and just under 2 years. And each time it goes, I hope it'll kick it into gear, but so far it has not. Interesting thing that happened there over the late 2025 is that Daisy's Thief, which hadn't been active since the early 1970s, had 3 episodes of activity. I do believe that was related to the October 7 eruption of Giant, but it has also not followed up with any further activity. After that, Bijou was on strong and steady for a couple of months until late February when it started pausing again. And another thing that happened during that transitional period was that Oblong went dormant and hasn't been seen since January 2. So I'll start with what is a giant hot period? The concept of a hot period was first introduced by George Marler, who wrote the following. It was not recognized until May 1951 that during an eruptive cycle, Giant has frequently recurring periods when both the temperature and the water suddenly rise in its crater. At the time of this change, several small vents on the platform in front of the broken section of the cone erupt to heights varying between inches and about 8 feet. Marked changes also occur in the larger units on the platform. I designated the time of this change as a hot period. It is the only time that giant can erupt at the time of one of these hot periods. These hot periods give me an impression as if a giant sponge at depths were suddenly being squeezed. And I love how this photo by Micah Hipple evokes that water oozing out of the giant platform. And in this photo, we see the platform vents Marler talked about in front of Giant's Cone. And to the left of Giant, massive geyser, which is boiling and overflowing. And I will introduce our full cast of characters in a moment, but generally speaking, giant hot periods refer to the periodic cycles of giant and connected vents nearby. Water and temperatures rise, and when that happens, there is potential for a giant to erupt. Somewhat similar to how there is potential for Grand Geyser to erupt around the time of Turbine Geyser when the water level is high in Grand's pool. But of course, the time scale for Giant is much longer, over a period of days, usually when it's active. And as I noted earlier, we're currently still waiting for the next active phase. But giant hot periods are probably the most fascinating thing I have ever watched as a geyser gazer. There's just so much going on, the cycles and the patterns and the shifts. And I wanted to make this available so that whenever Giant does reactivate, I won't be prepping slides. I will be there hoping for a chance to see it. If we go back to the quote from George Marler, how did he know that when there was a hot period, the temperature would rise by several degrees Fahrenheit and the water level came up in Giant and neighboring Mastiff Geyser? This is how. Marler was a ranger naturalist and then park geologist in Yellowstone from the 1930s through the 1960s and got to witness Giant's incredible activity in the early 1950s. A lot of our early information about Giant comes from his research and extensive writings. And as we see here, he was able to do some hands-on field work to learn more about the processes at play in the Giant group. Of course, we can't see or measure what's actually happening beneath the surface in Giant's plumbing system, so we have to rely on the visible manifestations. These days, we are making all of our observations from the boardwalk. The best viewing will be from the platform, which we call the cage because of this railing around it. And from that platform, we can see pretty much everything that is relevant around Giant. And in this photo, you can see that Bijou Geyser, which is on the far left is off, and I am waiting to see if there will be visible water in Mastiff. Because that will be the first indication that a giant hot period might happen. And I'll go into a lot more detail later, but I want to introduce the basic hot period sequence before I talk about some specific features. After Bijou pauses, there may be visible water rising in Mastiff. If water continues to rise in Mastiff, the platform vents may overflow. If Mastiff then drops without the platform vents starting to erupt, we call that a bathtub because of how Mastiff looks when it is full. It looks like a bathtub. It's a significant event, but it's not a full hot period. If it's a full hot period, platform vents will start erupting and then Mastiff may overflow and boil. Then Mastiff will drop and the platform vents will usually stop when Mastiff drops. So it'll be up for a period of time and then it will drop. Platform vents will stop. And finally, Bijou will come back on. One other character to discuss here is the GIP, Giant's Indicator Pool. Um, and it is actually not visible from the platform, but it's one of the easiest ways to gauge water levels in the group because it can be seen from the boardwalk going north towards Grotto. Water level in the GIP is usually down several feet below the rim, like it is in this photo. In fact, I think I was trying to show that it was there, but you can't really see it. But you can see it when it comes up with a giant hot period. So this is what it will look like when Mastiff is full and overflowing a few inches down below that rim. So back to the platform, there's Bijou Geyser in eruption and Catfish on the right. The default for Bijou is that it is erupting. But Bijou is very important to the sequence of a hot period because when the water level cycles up in Mastiff, Bijou will slow down or completely shut off. And the vast majority of the time, a giant hot period will start during that Bijou pause. Catfish is on the same mound with Bijou, and when Bijou is erupting, Catfish may have small splashes. The right hand vent of Catfish, the one closer to the platform vents, may have splashing during a giant hot period. And probably the most important thing about Catfish is that both vents of Catfish will respond to Mastiff dropping with splashing that goes 10 to 20 feet, depending on how strong the hot period was, which can be a really helpful clue if there's a lot of steam and you can't see Mastiff very well. You can tell that it has dropped when the water comes up in Catfish. We move on to the platform vents. These are all these little holes in front of Giant's cone. Feather is the tallest of the platform vents, and canonically, its eruption has been used to designate the start and end of a giant hot period. And I'll come back to that later on. But just to the left of Feather is Feather Satellite, which are up to about a foot and show up in your medium and strong hot periods, probably not in your weaker ones. To the right is Rust, which is a kind of crack in front of Giant's cone. It erupts to a few inches and can be active ahead of Feather or after Feather. Then moving farther over to the right, we have Cave, which has usually been active with stronger hot periods only. In this photo, it's overflowing. I'll have a photo of it actually erupting later on. That eruption can reach 2 to 3 feet high. On the edge of the platform is the southwest vents, which is actually a cluster of 3 vents that erupt together to about a foot. The southwest vents may start before or after Feather, and they may be active during bathtubs as well as hot periods. And then in front of Feather, farther from Giant, are three vents in a line that tend to be active in the later stages of a hot period. We have post hole in the center, which comes on after massive has dropped and splashes from a few inches to maybe a foot. To the left of post hole is an even smaller vent, post hole satellite, which will join in with post hole when it's active. And then finally, to the right of it is emerald. It can be active at kind of other times, and I'll mention that later. But during a hot period, it comes up in bubbles along with post hole, and then it may stay up and be bubbling for some minutes after an event on the giant platform has ended. And then turtle geyser is pointed out in this diagram. I'll show you two photos of it as well. All the way down on the south end, kind of on its own little peninsula. And turtle may participate in longer hot periods by bubbling and overflowing. So that's what you see in the photo on the left. And that bubbling would be less than a foot high. And on very rare occasions, turtle may have a full eruption during a hot period. And I took that photo on the right in 2005 during a hot period. So here's another look at a giant hot period in progress. I put yellow arrows to designate rust in front of Giant's Cone and then cave over on the right. They're kind of hard to pick out because they're small and a little bit less geographically anchored than the Southwest Vents and Feather are. And then in this same photo over in the center of the platform, both vents of Mastiff are boiling. On the left is the front vent of Mastiff, which is the most important vent to watch. The back vent of Mastiff on the right is mostly along for the ride, but there may be boils up to about 2 feet during a hot period. So going into more detail about Mastiff boiling and surging, kind of two views of the same hot period here. The activity may vary widely. It may Mastiff may only come up right up to overflow and not overflow. It may put out a dribble of overflow. It may have steady overflow with some boiling. This is getting to be where it's having a stronger hot period. The boiling is picking up in the photo on the left. And then the photo on the right is a really nice boil, a surge really from Mastiff. So it's going to get convex over the vent. It's going to become wide. You can see it's almost to the height of Giant's Cone here. Giant's Cone is 10 feet tall for a frame of reference. It has been known for Mastiff to surge up to 15 feet without triggering an eruption. So that is rare, but it has been seen. Maybe even more important than surging, though, is the amount of runoff that makes it down off the platform. One of the ways we can gauge how much Mastiff overflows is by looking at a prominent slab of sinter located just in front of the cage, right below the large interpretive sign, and it's in the center there. And we've nicknamed it India because it does indeed look like the prominent peninsula in South Asia. And to be clear, because it matters when we're talking about how much India was covered by percentage, geographically, we are talking about peninsular India and not the country or the subcontinent. So it's this area inside the yellow triangle. The reason that India is so useful to help gauge the runoff from Mastiff is that there's a raised section on this center slab in this blue oval. And it will stay dry if Mastiff puts out moderate overflow. But it will be increasingly covered with water as Mastiff puts out more discharge. So here are a couple screen grabs as examples of that. On the left, is kind of a moderate hot period. The water is running around the sides of India, so there's a decent flow from Mastiff. And we would call that maybe somewhere 40 to 50% covered there. On the right, we see there's just a bit of an island left on the right side of India, and we call that maybe about 85% covered, maybe 90% covered, depending on how much of that island gets covered. A strong hot period will totally cover India, and when it's looking good for Giant to erupt, there will be actually a flow of water across India. And a final component of the hot period activity is surging in Giant. Sometimes it will show high water level during the hot period when massive is up, and that is never a bad thing. You want to see that. But the most critical time for Giant is after mastiff has dropped. Feather may stay on or it may stop and then restart. Either way, about 1 to 2 minutes after the massive drop, there may be surging in Giant's cone. I've got a couple of pictures here. The surges will be low in the cone at first and progress stronger and higher. Generally, the taller and thicker the surging, the better chance for Giant. Halfway up the cone is good, 3/4 is better. By the time Giant is thinking about actually erupting, it will be to the height of the cone and over top. All of this is definitely worth noting, even if that's as far as it gets. The water level may then drop in Giant, in which case the surging will start to be predominantly angled. And that angle will be from left to right, so away from the platform, over the side of the cone. So this photo on the left shows the water level is going down, the water is slopping out onto the right side of the cone, even though it is still at the height, it's actually over the height of the cone. So it had good surging in the top period. Water level was high, but now it's dropping down, and you can see that angle developing. If the surging is going to build to an eruption, it will look like the photo on the right. Straight up, filling the cone, often pulsating up and down, but getting higher each time, and pouring water out the front. So just a brief note here about the hot period definition migration. The quote that I read earlier from Marler, he originally based the definition on the temperature and water rise in Giant and Mastiff. Then there was a long period of time when no hot periods occurred, and Giant had a very, very few eruptions between 1955 and 1986. When hot periods started happening again in the late 80s, events without feather were called minor hot periods. We now call these bathtubs, and I'll get into more detail about that soon. Into the late 1990s, terms like a 3 event hot period were still used to talk about the strength of a hot period. But since 1997, a giant hot period has referred more specifically to an eruption of feather vent. And the duration of the hot period is the duration of feather. So any other event not including feather would be entered into geyser times under giant hot period, but as a note, not an eruption. So I've been talking a lot about in a strong hot period and a weak hot period. I'm going to get very specific here about that. When we're gauging hot period strength, we're looking at feather, so the strength of it, the height, the duration. Other vents that are active along with feather, and the ones that are most important to understanding hot period strength are feather satellite and cave. With mastiff, you're going to be looking at overflow volume and the amount and height of the boiling and surging. After mastiff has dropped, does feather quit or continue? If it quits, it's a little bit weaker. If it continues, that's definitely stronger. And then post hole, how strong is it when it comes on? The restart of feather, which happens after a hot period, the water comes back up in feather and may come back up in giant as well. Water levels rise in giant, and that's when you get the surging I was just talking about. If it happens quickly after the massive drop, if the height and volume is growing and there's water coming out of the cone, and then as I mentioned, is it vertical or is it angled? Those are all things that I would use to gauge how strong a hot period is. So next, I'm going to go over some examples of event timelines, and I want to emphasize that these should not be taken literally. Within any of the categories I'm going to talk about, there can be a range of timing and activity, and different active phases will have some different variations, and some norms will develop during any particular time. So if you're thinking, well, I saw one that was different than that, yeah, you probably did. I'm really just trying to create a framework that will be useful in describing all the different stages of a hot period and the strength of those events and hot periods. I'm going to work weakest to strongest and focus on the six most important features as far as timing goes. And that would be bijou, mastiff, feather, southwest vents, cave, and giant. So start with bathtubs. So again, bathtubs happen when bijou pauses and stays off long enough for mastiff to rise well into view from the boardwalk. If it's just barely visible, we would call that a foot bath. With a bathtub, bijou will be off for 3 to 4 minutes, and front mastiff will fill up so it looks like a bathtub. And the higher it gets, the more likely that some vents will show water in front of Giant's cone and start overflowing. If bijou stays off for longer, this timeline shows 5 minutes, but it could be up to 8 minutes. Things might progress enough for the southwest vents to start spitting or fully erupting. Rust can also be active during this type of activity, and we call that a bathtub plus. So not quite a hot period because feather didn't go, but we still have some platform vents on. And if mastiff drops before feather begins, that is all you're going to get with that event. But bathtubs are definitely an important piece of the puzzle at Giant and definitely worth noting and calling on the radio. Next, we have a sample weak hot period, and weak hot periods will range from under a minute long to about 4 minutes. Along with feather, a second vent will usually join in, either southwest vents or rust, or maybe feather satellite. And that will depend on which direction the energy is going, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Mastiff may not get to overflow during a weak hot period, or it might dribble some overflow or put out one good push with some low boiling. That would all fit under the category of a weak hot period. So even if the feather duration makes it out past 3 or 4 minutes, if there hasn't been very much discharge overall, feather's probably not erupting to full strength. Massive drops before any discharge can make it off the platform. All of that type of activity would be classified under a weak hot period. Moving on to the medium hot period. That'll stretch out the timeline out past 4 minutes. And I've included that as an important marker here because when hot periods are strong enough for mastiff to boil, they're kind of two phases of that boiling. So that's what I'm referring to here with phase one, the first period of boiling that will take place in minutes 2 and 3 approximately of the hot period. And then around 4 minutes, it is common for mastiff to go flat, or at least for the boiling to weaken, kind of the 4 minute slow down. With a medium hot period, there might be some pretty good boiling in that first phase, with a sustained period of discharge and water coming off the platform. And then around 4, maybe 5 minutes into feather, mastiff goes flat and then drops. So these are kind of half of a strong hot period, but mastiff can't get past that first phase. It drops and feather will stop shortly after it drops. These medium hot periods can have quite a bit of activity from the vents. So feather satellite, rust, southwest vents, cave may be bubble along. Sometimes, like in 2018, you could even get an eruption of cave in a medium hot period. I hadn't seen that prior to 2018 though. So usually it takes a pretty strong hot period to get cave. And a final note here about this timeline that I made for the medium hot period. I've got the feather duration going out to 5.5 minutes. But if you get a good push of runoff from mastiff, it could still be a pretty strong, a medium hot period, as long as you get that good push of runoff from mastiff. So it could be pretty compact and only 3.5 minutes long. That's rare, but it can happen. Or things could progress really, really slowly. And if all the stages kind of spread out longer, it could even stretch out to 6 or 7 minutes and still be a medium hot period. The key is that mastiff isn't boiling much past that 4 minute mark into feather, and then it drops without boiling anymore. So this shows what happens if mastiff continues to boil after that 4 minute slowdown. The chance to look at everything happening here. So the south function eruption hot period, the I think I just yeah, here we go. Sorry about that. Baseline strong hot period. That's what I wanted to talk about next. So, mastiff, you see the first period of boiling, and then I've got another period of boiling here in the second phase of the hot period. So, instead of dropping after that, mastiff is flat but overflowing stage, the 4 minute slowdown, mastiff comes back and starts to boil again, and it may boil pretty high. It may put out quite a bit more overflow. Feather will be erupting all through this time. So a baseline strong hot period, a duration of somewhere in the order of 8 minutes, maybe 7, maybe 9, would be pretty normal. You'll get the southwest vents, and then sometimes cave would bubble, sometimes it would erupt. In 2018, we pretty much got cave on all of our strong hot periods, but in some years, it would only bubble. And then the key to this hot period as compared to the next slide that I accidentally went forward to is that feather stops after mastiff drops. So you'll have a duration of feather, it will stop, there will be a break, bijou will come back on again, and then after that, the duration of the hot period will have been long enough. I have a note to myself from some years ago that a hot period needed to be 5.5 minutes long in order to have one of these feather restarts. I don't know whether that's quite applicable across all active phases. It was true in 2006 and 2007. Um, but here, my baseline hot period lasts 8 minutes, feathers off for maybe a minute to a minute and a half, and then it comes back on. The water comes up in feather, it'll come back up in the southwest fence and rust sometimes. You get split post hole satellite, not on this chart, but they will be active with a restart, and then you get the water rising in Giant's Cone. All right, now we go forward to the eruption hot period. Ideally, for an eruption to occur, feather will not stop when mastiff drops. So mastiff drops, bijou comes back on, feather just continues. The stronger it continues, the better it is for a chance at giant eruption. The giant will start surging in its cone. That surging will take 2 to 4 minutes to build, and then you get the giant eruption, usually in the order of about 2 to 3 minutes after mastiff has dropped, sometimes even out as far as 4. And this is a south function hot period. So I need to explain that this will happen when the energy is very, very strong to the looker's right, to the south end of the giant platform. So that's why we will get cave erupting, because cave is over there on the side. You'll notice I have the southwest vents actually erupting ahead of feather. That is common with a south function hot period, really of any length, is that southwest vents will start before feather. And then the key here is that if the energy is towards the south, then it will be a giant initiated eruption. So in that restart phase of the hot period, giant's going to come up and start surging, and it's going to take charge of initiating the eruption. If energy is on the looker's left side over towards mastiff, that would be a north function eruption hot period, and mastiff is going to take charge in that case. So we see here with the timeline, I've got southwest vent starting after feather. They may even start quite a bit after feather. Cave may only bubble or it may erupt. And then that second phase of mastiff surging that happens in phase 2 of the hot period, from about 5 to 7 minutes into the hot period, maybe into 8 minutes. Massive surging will get stronger and stronger, get even more overflow from it. India will be covered. That surging will get to the height of the cone, over cone height, and trigger an eruption of mastiff. And so in this case, instead of giant surging triggering the eruption, you get mastiff erupting first. And mastiff will usually erupt anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes before giant joins in. You'll see giant start to surge along with mastiff, and just haven't been mentioning bijou too much, but bijou will go into steam pretty much as soon as mastiff starts to erupt. So it's going to be loud steam phase, and then when this happens, you can also get eruptions of catfish. So mastiff initiated with the north function strong hot period. Going back to the south function for just a second to talk about some extreme outliers that have been seen. There are two rarer possibilities with the energy strong on the south side of the platform. One is that feather can take a brief pause, usually only a few seconds, but in one case up to 40 seconds, and giant erupts on the restart. So in this timeline, I would have a little bit of a break between feather erupt and feather coming back on for the restart, but giant erupts anyway. It's going to have the same timing as if feather had not shut off. So this very brief shut off um, is meaningful to note, but when giant really wants to go, the one time I saw, it's like feather stopped and I looked over at giant and it just had this huge surge over the top of the cone right away. So it was still definitely I was feeling very positive about a chance for Giant on that hot period, despite the fact that Feather had quit. And they're actually quite rare, these restart eruptions. There was only one seen in 1997, and then it was seen three times each in 2006 and 2007, and not at all in 2018. And the other outlier with South Function is to kind of scrap the whole first part of this timeline because the hot period starts very, very slowly. Not much going on. Maybe just Feather and Southwest, a little trickle of runoff from Mastiff, but it's just kind of hanging in there. And then when it gets into that phase two portion, suddenly everything gets stronger. Feather satellite suddenly comes on. Maybe Cave also joins in. Mastiff starts boiling. You get heavy discharge. Maybe not tall boiling in Mastiff, but it's pouring out discharge, and the water comes up in Giant, and you get a south function eruption of Giant. So the lesson here, just to mention those outliers, is to keep moving towards Giant, no matter what has shut off or what hasn't been. Um, it hasn't been much massive boiling or something like that. Keep moving towards Giant until the whole thing is over, because things can progress very quickly. So will be some outliers with the north function as well. They have usually happened when water levels in the group are extremely high during April and early May. So most of these outliers that I'm talking about were during April and early May. I won't go into detail about the very weird hot periods and massive solo eruptions that occurred in April of 2006. Those are kind of in a category by themselves. You can read about them in my article in Transactions 10. If you are really curious about it, you can contact me. I can give you some more details about it. But I want to talk about some other outliers that happen a little bit more often. Um, the double mastiff eruption, which has happened a total of 5 times that we've seen now. And I should mention, I was looking at eruption hot periods. We've seen somewhere, a little over 90 uh, eruption hot periods that I was able to find details for out of 319 eruptions since 1955. So it's a decent sample, just a little less than a third that we've seen and recorded details about. So 5 of these um, double mastiff. Basically, instead of getting your first phase of mastiff boiling and your second phase of mastiff boiling, you get your first eruption of mastiff, and then your second eruption of mastiff. And in between, there's a gap, usually 3 to 4 minutes long. Everything stops. It's always a confusing time as a geyser gazer. I've been lucky enough to see it happen twice, though. And so the second time, I had a feeling that it was still going to erupt. You want to see water come back up in Mastiff and Giant, and as long as they do, it will lead to an eruption. And then another outlier, just to mention briefly, is that the shortest timeline that I was able to find for the start of Feather to the start of Giant occurred on August 10, 1997. Mastiff started erupting only 3 minutes into Feather, and then Giant 2 minutes after that. So just if you're trying to gauge how fast you need to be moving, there is an outlier that says it could be only 5 minutes from the start of Feather to the start of Giant. This is one of those double mastiff eruptions that occurred on May 4 of 2018. And just to give you an idea how dominant the left side of the platform was, I'm there pointing at the southwest vents coming on during the second eruption of mastiff. And just kind of going back over this is a screen grab from Micah's video, and zoom in on this lady. She is pretty sure I have completely lost my mind. So I should also mention that after a giant hot period, Bijou will come back on Depending on how strong the hot period was, there may be some steam mixed in. If it was really strong, it would be a lot of steam. It'll be kind of forcefully pushing out. You'll be able to hear it pushing steam out with a strong hot period. And then at Mastiff, it will be splashing, which is kind of water level way down in the crater and then splashing up. That's called depth charging. And you might see some angled water in Giant after a hot period. This activity will tend to scale with the strength of the hot period, as I mentioned. So it's really important to note here that if you ever see a weaker event, like a bathtub or a weak hot period, resulting in strong steam from Bijou, with that noisy steam and that energetic depth charging from Mastiff, and especially if that behavior persists without stopping or losing strength, that is a time when you want to stick around. May not be the very next thing that happens at giant erupts, or it may. I have definitely seen uh, that lead to both a progression of hot periods that led to giant and just the next hot period, giant erupted. So, with all this that I'm talking about, what to note and what to call on the radio, this is a list of the things I think are most important that I will include in my Geyser Times entries and my written notes. And then if you're calling on the FRS radio, it can be pretty difficult to juggle a radio, a notebook, a camera, whatever other equipment you have. So if there's more than one person there, definitely one person taking notes, one person taking video, one person calling will make it a lot easier. To really simplify it, you got the time, the event, and the action. And if there isn't much action happening, update on a minute with what is going on the platform. I like to think about it a basic rule of thumb. What would if I was listening on the radio and running or pedaling to get down there, what would I want to know? And there have been so many times when somebody included a detail like cave came on before feather satellite, or cave started overflowing before the hot period started, things like that that got me moving faster and allowed me to see giant erupt on a strong hot period. And also try not to leave people hanging, wrap it up if it's over. I know sometimes it can be difficult to tell, but in general, try to be as complete as possible. And then, of course, if you're not calling, avoid cross traffic during the time that the hot period is in progress. Some tips for observing hot periods. Well, they got to be happening, obviously. Otherwise, you're just kind of staring at the platform looking to see if there is any water. And there have been a couple of times when water was seen ahead of a giant eruption that the interval had been many months and there were no hot periods, but there was some water coming out of, for example, rust and slit. So it is worth checking on. I've included this photo because it has some puddles. Um, so this goes into the fourth bullet here, which is pay attention to how platform looks after bathtubs and hot periods. Um, the amount of water in the and where the puddles are located can tell you a lot about what vents were active and maybe how long the hot period was. By in the late 2018, I had seen enough aftermath of hot periods to be able to kind of guess that pretty well. So it's a very useful thing to note. Ryan Maurer in his presentation, by the way, which was very excellent, talking about capturing photographs of geyser moments. He mentioned, one of the, if you're trying to document something, one of the most effective ways is to just take a video and then go back and do your notes from the video. And I will say I was doing that a lot in 2018, but you could also use a voice recorder to do the same thing. That can be very helpful. The third bullet here, come prepared at night. That means having your stuff in order in case you need to move it quickly. The wind can be in kind of weird directions at night. It can be very, very steamy. Um, so definitely that's a time when if you're not prepared for the hot period, things could progress quickly and your stuff could get really wet. I compare the difference between getting sprayed by beehive, that's kind of like being in the sprinkler. Uh, Getting hit with giant is more like having a swimming pool dumped on top of you. And then this final point, if you see something really strange, nothing beats video and narrative description. So way back when we had the Geyser listserv, those narrative descriptions were very, very valuable. You could get somebody's impression of what was going along with the sequence. So those additional comments in the Geyser Times entries these days that give a little bit more context to what you saw, those are extremely valuable, and you can go back and look at those later and be reminded of something that you probably forgot over the years. I am not going to be able to talk about Grotto very much tonight. This is a very short summary um, about the Grotto cycle. Recently, it's actually been quite short, but historically, it's been an average about 6 hours, normal range 4 to 8 hours for an interval of Grotto. Irregular or short mode eruptions will usually last 1 to 3 hours, and then every 1 to 3 days, under historic circumstances, we would get a long mode eruption, which is referred to as a marathon. And these can be very important to giant because when Grotto erupts for a long time, it's then off for a long time. And during that off time, the water level can come up in giant. And so that's when you can get some of your strongest hot periods is in that marathon recovery time. And just quickly, this last point, the GIP is kind of an in-between feature of the two, and it will tend to have higher water levels near the start of Grotto, near the end of Grotto, and sometimes 5 to 7 hours into a marathon. And those are times when you can get strong hot periods. And that I think holds true even if we're not in an active phase. So even if it's been some months since the last eruption, as long as you're having hot periods, these times, the start of Grotto, the end of Grotto, and sometimes deep into a marathon, that water level will come up in the GIP and you have a chance for giant. So I want to briefly talk about the marathon recovery because that is very, very important time for giant hot periods. Um, People talk about marathon recovery hot periods a lot. So what is the prevalence of marathon recovery hot periods? Well, it depends on the active phase. 1997-98, it was about 1/3 of giant eruptions came on this marathon recovery hot period. Then from 2001 to 2004, there were none. Then during the 2005 to 2008 active phase, about half came from marathon recovery hot periods. And then in 2018, 2019, Grotto was barely having marathons at all. So we did not have marathon recovery hot periods during that active phase either. The time that you're going to look for the hot period to occur is when Bijou is kind of barely starting to come on after Bijou has been shut off during a Grotto marathon. Grotto will erupt long enough that it just drains out the water from the giant platform. Bijou stops for a very, very long time, a matter of hours, and then gradually begins to come back. So you're looking for that recovery hot period to be about the same time as Bijou starts to show water again, or hopefully after. The longer you're waiting for that hot period, the better. And just to give a brief sense of the timing in 1997-98, marathons lasted 10 to 14 hours, and recovery times with the giant eruption were 5 to 8 hours. And then in 2006 and 2007, much longer marathons, short of 17, but a long of 38. And many of the marathons that had a giant eruption following them were at least 21 hours And then the recovery times then would be longer, take even longer for it to recover from all the water draining out. So 7 to 16 hours was your range for when that marathon recovery hot period would happen after the end of Grotto. So that's an important factor, is when Grotto ended. If you're going to get a marathon recovery hot period, knowing exactly when Grotto ended is very, very helpful. And then paying attention to what's been normal and how long those marathons have been running will give you a sense of when to be there. Another thing I should mention here is that in 2018, besides the start and end of Grotto being times of hot periods, also it kind of favored the time. There were a number of examples when Giant erupted right around the time that Rocket was first due during a Grotto eruption. And there were a number of times when we basically got Giant instead of Rocket. Those were definitely memorable, but when I went back and looked at the overall activity of the summer, there was kind of a combination. Some of them, Giant erupted when Rocket hadn't gone, and sometimes Rocket did go either before or after Giant. So Rocket erupting did not prevent Giant from having a chance to erupt in those circumstances. And unfortunately, that's about all I have time for with Grotto. But I did want to mention this one final thing. This I borrowed from Jake Young. Thank you so much, Jake, for giving permission to kind of repurpose this flow chart that he made for geyser times. And hopefully, if Giant is active again, it will become available again. I'm going to put it up here. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but this is one of the reasons I wanted to mention marathons and the fact that Bijou shuts off after marathon because it appears in this flow chart. Just overall, I think this flow chart is very, very basic and very useful for basic decision making about how to spend your time if giant. And again, this is relevant when giant hot periods are happening. If giant hot periods are not happening, VG could be off, it could be on, it could be a marathon recovery, it could be a normal grotto. Unfortunately, it's just going to pick some moment to go. It might be on a marathon recovery, it might be on uh, the start of a grotto. It might be towards the end of the grotto. The one in October was apparently right about an hour into grotto. So no marathon associated with that October eruption. Unfortunately, right now, it is just not giving very many clues. So just a few things that kind of came up while I was putting this together. Like I mentioned, those added contextual comments with the giant hot period entries, like what Grotto was doing, are just super helpful. Really help me know where to look for other information about the what was happening in the cycle. Um, Another example of something like that would be in September of 2018. There were a couple of hot periods where Cave came on before Feather Satellite, and that's extremely rare. And the first one I was thinking, huh, that's weird. And the second one, Giant erupted. So those kind of details can be super important and helpful. I would encourage anyone who's listening who's been watching giant hot periods for any more than just the 2018 active phase, but also including that. If you have historical hot period data that isn't in geyser times, and want to take on a fun project, adding that data will help us understand better. I have the information about those 90 some eruptions, but maybe there's more out there. And then the same goes for connected geysers. We could learn more about the giant grotto relationship, the more of that information that is in geyser times. And then finally, if there are hot period and eruption videos that you'd like to share and upload those, you can link those to eruption entries in geyser times. And I wanted to show you this picture of giant erupting because I have gone this entire way without finishing the deal here with an eruption. So this goes kind of back to Ryan's presentation about capturing the moment. In this case, I just told Scott where to stand for this eruption because it's how the lighting and the wind were turning out, and we got this spectacular capture. And with that, I will open it up for questions.
I'll go ahead and ask you one here real quick while we wait for questions to come in. So I've heard stories before of some people talking about like the sequence of events building up to a hot period looking encouraging. Like, for example, um, Bijou not having any pauses for an extremely long time, or the water level in the Gip continuing to rise. Um, how consistent are little clues like that, and are there any other sort of things that you can look for, assuming that you're expecting a hot period at some point?
Yeah, that's a great question, and those are really great examples of things that we've seen. I would say it. I would put it in the category of if you see things like Bijou not stopping and coming, like I mentioned, when there comes on after a weaker hot period and then just stays on. I've seen that lead directly the very next event to happen was a giant hot period. I've also seen where the next thing to happen was another weak event and then another strong bijou restart. So it was like pausing of every hour to 2 hours. Um, it's not a slam dunk. I think I would be comfortable saying that if we're having hot periods and we're assuming that there's potential for giant to erupt, if it does that sort of activity where it has a very strong bijou restart and then doesn't pause until the next event, um, to go. And at very least, you're going to get an attempt. At very least, you're going to get a strong hot period. The GIP, boy, the GIP can lead you astray at times. Definitely, if you see it up at times when it shouldn't be, that is a time to stick around. I think you'll get a strong hot period and maybe an eruption from something like that. But if you think you can leave because the GIP is dropping, oh, that's a lot tougher. There have been some cases where um, the GIP was dropping and still somehow Giant figured out a way to erupt. So there aren't any, all these rules are made to be broken with Giant, obviously being a geyser. Um, but those are both things that I've seen that I thought were just stick around. Can I think of anything else? Ah, another one would be you're getting kind of restarts with um, with weaker hot periods. So the water level is high in Giant, but the durations aren't of the hot periods aren't very long. Okay, well, when it does have a long duration, that's a good time that you'll have a very strong hot period or maybe an eruption. And then another example I can think of is a sequence that I saw in 2007 where we had a couple of strong hot periods where the duration just didn't get out very long because Bijou came on early. So Bijou, I have in those timelines, I have it coming on maybe as early as 5 minutes after feather start and before mastiff drops. But in the case of the 2007, it came on 3.5 minutes after feather, and yet um, the hot period continued. The first two times it happened, water level dropped in mastiff and kind of hung there, and then the hot period ended. The third time, water level stayed high in mastiff. It continued to overflow despite the fact that Bijou was back on, and mastiff continued to surge, and feather continued to erupt after mastiff dropped, and we got giant. So a lot of it is very contextual with what's been happening. Um, but Great question. Sorry if my answer got a little long-winded.
No worries. Okay, so it looks like, let's see. You had cave stop at 8 minutes and not through to giant start. I can't remember, but it stops before giant starts? Question mark. That's Graham asking.
Yes. So I went back and looked at videos to see just what would happen. Cave will usually stop when mastiff drops, and I don't think I found a single example, although there may be one out there, where cave continued on well after mastiff dropped. So it might hang on as long as feather was strong, but it has not been known to participate in that restart section of the hot period. Thanks for the question. Sorry I didn't cover that in the timeline.
All right. What are the effects of weather, both short term, example rain, or long term seasonal water table stuff?
So this is something that we don't know a lot about. I will say that I have never seen anything at Giant that made me think it has the kind of response to weather that Beehive does. And Beehive obviously recently has been showing a lot of response to weather. We've been able to study it more thanks to Corbin and the detail that he's been going into at Beehive. So I've never seen anything where a storm came in or something ephemeral like that and things changed at Giant. Um, and I have seen Giant in all kinds of crazy, nasty weather. I've seen it with a storm, a literal storm front coming in, lightning, high winds, rain. I've seen it in pouring rain, 42 degrees. I've seen it at 5 o'clock in the morning. That's, kind of these no-go zones for Beehive don't seem to affect Giant very much. But one thing I will say is it definitely responds to water table. Historically, and I go into this quite a bit in my previous presentation, historically it favored later months of the year, August, September, October, November, and kind of has been not studied enough about Giant is that it will respond to high water table levels in April. And the reason, of course, is that the park isn't open. So even in 2006, when we knew Giant was active, we did not know how active it was because there's just a period of time when hardly anyone is there. And there's certainly no geyser gazers there. The gates are closed, can't go in and see it. And so we did not know in 2006 what was happening. They were having intervals as short as 2 days, 17 hours in April of 2006. And we didn't know until that stretch was over. We did not realize how frequent it was during that time. And so you could get very, very high water levels in the group. In April of 2006, that included water lapping onto the boardwalk during eruptions of Oblong. That included the GIP being practically close to overflow. That included two eruptions of Grotto Fountain after a marathon. So you get one eruption of Grotto Fountain, and then a couple hours later, there would be another eruption of Grotto Fountain, and Grotto would finally start. So things, we had very, very high water levels in the spring of 2006. And there have been some other times like that in the spring as well. May of 1998, I'm sorry, 1997, May of 1997. So high water table stuff. And then May of 2018, we had those two double massive eruptions. So uh, that was one of those cases where Bijou actually did not stop. Everything was so strong. The energy was so strong on the north side of the platform and in Mastiff that Bijou just kept erupting even when Mastiff came up. So those would be examples of things that you will see when water table levels are high.
All right. What is the distribution of hot period strength leading into a giant eruption? Is there a point at which the hot period is too long to be hopeful for giant?
That's really good question. And I guess I should mention here that when it's hopeful for giant, you're going to be getting strong hot periods at least once a day. In June of 2018, I think they were happening every other day, and there were just a lot of bathtubs in between, but still they were happening very consistently. So you need that consistent um, strong hot period happening. And then I'm sorry, Ben, could you read the second half of that question?
Yeah, is there a point at which the hot period is too long to be hopeful for giant?
Yeah. Yeah, also very important. Yes. So that critical time, I've looked back, you can get shorter than 10 minutes from the start of feather to the start of giant. It could be as short as 5, 6 or 7. It's kind of on on the outlier end. Then 8, 9, you start getting into more common, and then 10, 11, 12 minutes after the start of feather, that's your sweet spot. Whether mastiff erupts or whether it's triggered from giant surging, that kind of 10 to 12-minute range is when you're going to see most of those eruptions happen. And then 13 is possible. I did not find a 14. So I did not find anything beyond 13 minutes from the start of feather to the start of giant. So there may be hot periods that the feather continues to erupt for 15, 16, even 17 minutes without stopping, or maybe if there's a short break and it comes back with a restart and it's active for that whole time. But I would say yes, there is definitely a point in the hot period there at 13 minutes where if giant has not managed to go, it is not going to in that hot period. Great question.
All right, we'll give it another minute or so here, see if we get any more questions. Have you found any variables that affect giant durations?
Yes. Not so much in 2018 though. Um, I looked at 2018 to see if it would match up with 2006, 2007. In 2006 and 2007, a very distinct difference between durations of giant, whether mastiff had erupted. Uh, when mastiff did erupt, it was shorter, and when mastiff did not erupt, it was longer. And it maybe Corbin asking that question because I shared it with him. He has noticed that when beehive's indicator goes, beehive duration will be shorter. So it's kind of the same thing going on. You have a lot of water and energy coming out of mastiff already, and that will shorten giant. But I will say, mastiff erupted only a few times in 2018, and I couldn't really see. There weren't that many. The sample wasn't very big, but I couldn't see where there was a big difference in the duration of giant. It just kind of giant durations got longer over the course of the summer as it got more active.
Okay, so another question. How do you define the end of an eruption?
So I can tell you what I have been using, and I know that over historical periods of time, it may have been different. Um, but kind of looking, using the philosophy of, the last energy to put water out of the cone. So you get splashes out of the cone. It's going to, kind of be tailing off there at the end. It's going to be having these huffs with steam. Eventually, one of those huffs will not have water in it, and it's going to go about, up to 2 minutes without having any water. So it could follow up with a little bit of water after that. But we're talking about sustained energy putting water outside of the cone. So once that sustained period has ended, that's when we would call the end of the giant eruption. a little bit like Great Fountain, where you're looking for when does it stop emitting water outside of its own crater.
I'll wait a few more seconds here to see if we get any more questions. All right, well, I think that just about wraps things up then. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. We hope you've enjoyed your winter season, and we look forward to seeing you all out in the basin this summer.